Good day, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on mandate and government influence on digital transformation. Um, I'm Dr. Zulfikar Adamu, and I'm an associate professor of strategic IT and construction at London South Bank University. Basically, this presentation is part of the BIM Harambe presentation series, and I hope that so far you've enjoyed yourself. Hopefully, I'll do my best to make sure that you continue to enjoy yourself in my own presentation. Who am I? Basically, I am an architect and an architecture engineer of some sort. I tend to specialize in things like BIM and digital construction, and I like Autodesk products in particular. I do a lot of computational modeling and simulation of buildings. I like data science and data analytics using Python programming language, and I'm into VR and AR development. Overall, I'm a nice guy, I think. Let's move on to this presentation, which I've basically developed into sort of five parts or agenda of some sort. The first part is going to talk about digital transformation as a global phenomenon, and then we'll start to go into the meat of the matter, where I'll talk about government interventions in form of mandates and maybe other alternatives. And at this stage, I'll probably use BIM as an example of what could be mandated for digital transformation in construction. The third part of my presentation will talk about risks associated with government interventions, what happens when governments try to get involved and mandate things or whatever. And then the fourth part, we'll talk about barriers to technology adoption. And finally, we'll end with being mandate or nudge or whatever. What do you mandate? Who do you mandate? And when do you do the mandation? So, part one, digital transformation as a global phenomenon. Um, there's a lot of countries around the world are moving towards digitization. They're digitizing their economies in different ways. And what you see here is just a simple graph that shows you a lot of countries in the world that have been spread into a sort of four quadrants kind of chart, where you have, for example, on the bottom left, you have the watch out countries. Those are countries facing significant challenges with their low state of digitization and low momentum. Okay, they're not really digitized, but you need to watch out for them because they are kind of moving backwards, and their pace of digitization is not really moving in the right direction. And then the bottom right, you have the breakout countries. These are countries that are, well, they are low scoring in their current situation, but they are evolving rapidly. They are kind of, breaking out more or less. So they are quickly evolving, and there's headroom, there's room for improvement and progress. And then the top right hand corner, you have the standout countries. These are highly advanced and digitized in their economies. And the top left corner, you have the stall out countries who have advanced so much that they've stalled out and they're not really making as much progress as they would love to make because, hey, there's a sort of saturation of digitization that's going on there. Right, so this is just a sort of global picture, and whoever you are watching this presentation, you might want to see if your country is represented and whether or not it is a stall out country, a standout, or a watch out country. And in some cases, you see there's some sort of overlap. For example, Algeria, Nigeria, Brazil, and Vietnam are somewhere between watch out and breakout, whereas Hong Kong, Japan, and the UK are somewhere between standout and stall out. So we'll see how it goes. But that data is from 2015 anyway, so it might be a little bit outdated. So how does this concern in construction anyway? You may ask. Okay, stall out, watch out, breakout countries. Well, actually, every industry is undergoing digital transformation, like I've mentioned in the previous slide. Every aspect of every economy is digitizing in one form or the other. The problem is that construction is lagging behind. If you look at this chart by McKinsey, it shows that construction is the second least digitized industry in the world. It's only better than agriculture and hunting. And in this world where we're in an information and data driven age, where we're looking at things like BIM and smart buildings and sensors and IoT and drones, you might be wondering, how come we still, not so digitized? You don't have to look at it from maybe just the BIM perspective of what's happening in developed countries. On the global scale, that is, construction is not very digitized. So this narrative has to change. Okay. Um, to change this narrative, therefore, a lot of governments have tried to become involved in trying to digitize their construction industries because construction is also a very critical aspect of most economies. In fact, when you have economic sort of slowdowns or whatever, one of the things some governments like to do is to pump money into construction or infrastructure because they know it will generate jobs, and the supply chain is so integrated with different aspects of the economy that you end up stimulating the economy when you have some sort of recession of some sort. Okay, so we want to change that narrative, and governments are doing their best. And this is one of the reasons why they try to get involved through some sort of mandate or the rest. So I'll talk about that shortly. But before I do that, it's important for us and even for governments to understand how people adopt technology. You can't just expect people to just become digitally transformed all of a sudden. You see, if you look at any population, Rogers model, which here has been Rogers model is 1983 model of innovation diffusion, has been simplified in this triangle here, which shows that majority of the people involved in the construction industry, about 50% of them are late majority or laggards, which means they're skeptics, they're conservatives, they're not the type of people that will be enthusiastic when you bring in a new process or a new technology. This is just some statistical fact that has been established through since 1983 from Rogers Innovation Model. And then about 34% are early majority, and early adopters are about 13.5%, and innovators among us are only 2.5%. If you want to move towards digital transformation as an individual or as an organization, you need to be aiming to be at the top two layers. Be an innovator, be able to willing to take some risks, or be an early adopter. That way you can really, really digitally transform. It's no use if you're just getting your hand on your first CAD software in 2020. I mean, this is, if you've been manually drawing, then you've been left behind. You're probably a laggard. Now, when you a mandate or government influence comes into play, well, how does it come into play in terms of digital transformation, right? Why would governments want to do this? You see, many governments are concerned about productivity, about value for money, better collaboration, reducing waste in terms of time, money, or resources, etc. And BIM has one of those processes that have been used to digitally transform the construction industry, and its benefits in this regard are well documented in research and through case studies. So there's no doubt that if you were to digitize the construction industry, one way you will do that is to try to use BIM. um, but we know that 50% of the stakeholders in industry in most countries will be laggards when it comes to adopting new innovations. So there's going to be that resistance to change. These are called the dangerous majority, according to a friend of mine, Engineer Donatus. But you need to understand, governments especially, change agents need to understand that something called Newtonian logic is always at play. Newton's law of motion, which says an object will remain at rest, or when it's moving, it will only move in a straight path at a constant speed unless acted upon by an external force. So this refers to a stone in a football, a spacecraft, any object in our universe behaves basically using Newton's law of motion. So human beings, organizations are also entities that will behave in this way. They will probably have no need to change unless they're acted upon by an external force. So this is where government intervention can be sometimes helpful and necessary. Okay, so when you see them, individuals and organizations, resistance change, don't get angry, don't get mad. Understand that this is actually a natural disposition. It's they need help. They don't need to be castigated or condemned or you point fingers at them. Once you understand that this is a natural behavior, then you can appreciate that and see how you can engage with them going forward. So the choice is before any government, therefore, uh, do we do forced compliance? Do we force people to change? One way they could do that is, do some public sector mandates, because government is in charge of public sector things, and they can say, okay, for this public sector project, we want to mandate this or mandate that. Another way is to apply national mandates that includes the private sector. And how could they do that? I mean, I don't see how governments might force a private developer to use a technology or BIM in this hotel project, but they might say, we're not going to give you planning permission or approval to build this thing unless you give us this your design in, say, a digital format. You see, that's one way of mandating that indirectly. But the other approach that the government might want to use is what we call non-forced compliance. In this case, they might want to use things like subsidies and incentives to get people to do things. And they use that in many ways, in many aspects of our lives anyway. Or they use something called the nudge theory approach. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this subsequently. But it's important for people to realize that mandating things is not the only way a government can get things done. You can use subsidies, you can use nudge, and even if you're mandating, you can either mandate in public sector, or you can also try to do it in such a way that applies to the private sector as well. But the private sector mandating will be limited in many ways. So this is the part where I talk about government interventions in terms of mandates and alternatives, and I'll try to focus again, like I said earlier, on BIM as an example of how we can digitally transform the construction industry. Basically, if you look at this chart here, it just tells you, gives you a global overview of the different countries and their journeys towards mandating BIM. For example, in China, it's not yet mandatory, but use of BIM is accelerating. Okay, in Singapore, BIM is mandated for projects that have greater than 5,000 square meters, for example. In UK, a BIM level 2 mandate has been in place since 2016, but Scandinavian countries have been doing BIM and adopting BIM since the early 2000s. In fact, some will link it back to the 1990s. In France, 2017, yes, they planned a mandate of some sort, and so on and so forth. So different countries have different are on a different timeline of their journey towards mandating BIM, and this is how governments are getting involved and in those countries to make people or organizations and companies to adopt digital processes and technologies and the rest of it. Right. So let's go a little bit deeper to understand what some of these countries have done. If you take Scandinavian countries like Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, like I said earlier, they are regarded as pioneers. They've been doing this since the 90s and the early 2000s. In terms of leading mass adoption of BIM. Initially, it wasn't necessarily mandated. It was just sort of an enthusiasm that they showed, and gradually the governments got involved. Finland, for example, has been experimenting with BIM since 2002, and it forced people, or no, not forced, well, mandate is a force actually. It compel people to use IFC certified software as earlier as at 2007. IFC here stands for Industry Foundation Class, which is sort of standard for data exchange in the BIM world. Norway is another example, has been using IFC as well since 2010, and they had an agency called Sintef that was doing a lot of BIM research and pilot projects and helping the government to establish a national sustainability and development agenda using BIM as a sort of conduit for that. Denmark, on the other hand, as well, has also been doing BIM, mandating BIM on government projects since 2011, covering both local and national projects. And Sweden can trace its use of BIM, for example, uh, till as early as 1991, where they published the Swedish Standard Institute's guidelines on promoting BIM. And in fact, today it's said that only the US publishes more BIM related research than Sweden, for instance. So to show you how leading they are in this field. If you think about the UK, it's a country whose mandate is very popular actually, because they established the industry working group on BIM and they called for the adoption of BIM and mandating it from 4th of April 2016. So the mandate was announced in 2011 and the industry had like 5 years to prepare for it. So by 4th of April 2016, BIM became mandatory for public sector projects. And it's not just BIM was mandated, BIM level 2 was mandated because in the UK, there are ways of understanding BIM using levels and the rest of that, which I'll come to shortly. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the BIM level 2. So the change in performance was expected in industry in the UK, with the government providing support towards achieving it. And also, the government was very specific about what exactly we wanted. Not just saying we want BIM level 2. There were some specific requirements, technical and process-wise, that you had to apply to be able to say, yes, you are BIM level 2 compliant. At the same time, the BIM mandate was also linked to some sustainability outcomes as well through the soft landings framework and the rest of that. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but to tell you that the way the UK has adopted BIM is a bit more sophisticated than what the average country is doing out there because they tied it to sustainability and some other things like that. This is an example of the BIM wedge or the BIM maturity diagram, which more or less explains where BIM level 2 sits in the in the scale of things, where level 0 stands for drawings and lines, manual drawings. Level 1 is more or less CAD. Level 2 is 3D parametric modeling, and level 3 is something that's going to be a bit more sophisticated. We're getting there yet, but we're not quite there. So when it comes to France, well, as of 2nd December 2014, the French Task Force on Digitization of the Construction Industry was established, and they provided a report that showed that the French industry was not using digital solutions. Therefore, the minister, asked the task force to come up with a national initiative to stimulate digital transformation. And the result was a launching of what they call the Plan for the Digital Transition in the Building Industry, PTNB. Well, they are French, so I don't think this is what they actually called it. PTNB actually stands for, well, excuse me if my French is not very good, Plan Transition Numérique dans les Bâtiments, something like that. Plan for the digitization of the building industry, something like that. So the action plan was implemented over a 3-year period from 2014 to 2017, and subsequently, there are things that have been evolving since then. And this is just an overview of what the French BIM mandate was all about. It had 3 core objectives: to convince and mobilize the industry stakeholders, for example, to increase use of digital solutions, enhance the skills level of stakeholders, and develop a trusted digital ecosystem for everyone to work with. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but if you have spare time, I want to Google this and find out more about it. In the USA, America, Uh, there are no national BIM mandates, but there are national, state, and local initiatives that may qualify as a sort of quasi mandates, semi mandates of some sort. In fact, some of them are actually mandates, but they are not as exhaustive as you'll expect to find in other countries. There has also been a national treaty for the BIM program that is backed by the US's General Services Administration, and it has required people to adopt these programs since 2003. Wisconsin, for example, is one of the states that today obliges its contractors and designers to adopt BIM on all their public sector construction projects. But there were some criteria they had to use. First of all, they started with a pilot project around 2008, where they demonstrated the value of BIM on 13 projects worth about around $300 million. And by 2010, they now brought in a mandate when they were sure that everyone had understood the benefits. But it has to be the mandate had to apply to projects that were equal to more than $5 million. But if it was a new project, then it has of $2.5 million and above. Then if it's new, then it must use BIM. Okay. And in Los Angeles, the community college district required implementation of BIM on specific projects for some schools, I believe, and it's believed that this has saved the client up to $12 million in construction costs, because we know BIM tends to reduce waste and make things faster, better collaboration, and deliver better value for clients. So, having looked at some of these examples, what are the alternatives to mandate? Do you have to mandate? Not necessarily. One alternative is something called a motivational non-forced compliant approach. An example is what you call the nudge theory. Nudge, for example, wait, like when you hit someone with your shoulder and push him towards, the pathway or something like that, you're nudging someone. Um, Nudge is an aspect of choice architecture that changes people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding them being able to do something else or changing their economic incentives. Okay, and many countries have adopted nudge as a way of changing behavior in their society. Rather than force people to do something, they nudge them to do that thing. From the English word nudge, that's why nudge theory came about. It means you're trying to get a lot of people to do something on a national level, but you don't want to make it mandatory, but you do it in such a clever way that, well, they probably end up doing it because of the way you've presented the case to them. I'll give you some example. A good nudge, they say, is one that leads people towards making positive choices. For example, when you automatically enroll people on a pension scheme, that's a good thing, because in those days, um, most people will get a job and they will not enroll in a pension scheme, and they lose out, the government loses out, and the society has to bear the brunt of these people's quality of life when they become old. So what they've done was, to research, was say, okay, we know that pension is good for everyone, so there's no doubt about that. And we know that a certain percentage of one salary is acceptable as a standard, common amount that you could contribute to pension. So when you get a job in many countries, automatically you are enrolled into that pension scheme at that certain percentage based on how much you earn. It's now up to you to opt out if you want to. So rather than you opting into subscribe to pension, by default everybody's put into pension, and you can get out of that pension scheme if you don't want it. It's very unlikely that people will pull out. Most people will not pull out when they've been enrolled, but if you allow people to enroll on their own, they might forget. They might not know what percentage to even enroll for. They might put a pension and contribute just 1% because you told them to choose what percentage they wanted, and this is not good for society. So creating a default pension scheme is one way that nudge theory has worked, and this clearly has benefits for society as a whole. You know, um, so therefore, if you think about nudge in the context of the construction industry, governments can nudge organizations towards making relevant decisions and adopting the relevant processes and tools. For example, making digital technology easily available, subsidize BIM software, for example, make wireless networks available in construction sites for free or at a very cheap rate, boost skill acquisition and the rest of that. I could encourage them to utilize BIM technology or something like that. And this is quite different from when you force those companies to maybe you ban them from using drawing boards, for example, or you say no more using of CAD. We will penalize you if you use CAD. That's a sort of mandate. That's not the same thing. It's like you are not forcing them now to do or not to do one thing. Rather, you're encouraging them, you're incentivizing them to do something else. Such that even if they realize that you kind of trick them, they will not really mind, because at the end of the day, they realize the value. So one of the key aspects of nudge theory is that it must be something the government can defend in a court of law. The government cannot introduce a nudge that it cannot defend that decision in a court and say, this is why we nudge people to do this. For example, now we have the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, and if the government felt that use of face masks was going to be beneficial for the entire population. You could find a way to nudge people such that everyone was kind of finding themselves wearing face masks. And then when they realized it was the government's, clever way of doing it, no one can take the government to court and say they were forced to wear a face mask, because you were not forced, you were just nudged. And the benefits of wearing a face mask are obvious, so the government can win that court case in a court of law. So this is very, very important for those who are thinking about nudge and mandates. So when you think about how nudging BIM could work, like I explained earlier, when you communicate the potential and possibilities of BIM or digital technologies through pilot projects, through trainings and workshops, that is one way. And this has been used in Singapore, in the US, as through demonstrator projects. And in fact, in the UK, a popular demonstration project was what they call the Avanti project, that involved, the design and construction of Heathrow Terminal 5. Another approach that you could use is to provide funding to organizations who need to upgrade their ICT systems. Some organizations who struggle, for example, SMEs who are, scraping the bottom of the barrel, their bottom line is not that great anyway, and now you're asking them to invest in this process, in this technology, in these standards, in this training. It's not going to be easy for them. Okay, so this is one thing you could do to help SMEs. By nudging them towards BIM. Another way is to provide incentives and grants and tax breaks to on BIM related projects. If you had some projects that you could say, you know what, guys, we know this is a private sector project, but it's so important to the national economy. If you were to use BIM, for example, we will give you some tax breaks. It's been proven to, sorry, it's been shown through some research that the subsidy approach has been used a lot in Singapore, and it's one of the reasons why the country is regarded as a leader in BIM adoption. So this graphic here just simply summarizes different countries and how it's much, much richer than the other one I showed earlier, where they stood in terms of BIM adoption. Some countries have mandated some aspects of BIM, some have mandated a lot of BIM, some are only thinking about guidelines and whatever. They've not really made some mandates. Some have not done anything really. They're just thinking about it. They're still deliberating and considering the benefits of BIM and the rest of it. So what are the risks then that are associated with mandates and not? Because there are risks associated with these things. What are the things that you need to watch out for and plan for? Okay. The first is that in most countries in the world, SMEs will form the bulk of the industry. That's about 70 to 90% of the construction industry in most countries will comprise of SMEs. You're not going to have the big players forming the majority. Most of the time, it's going to be small companies, SMEs, and the rest of that. Okay. So, because of this fact, this group of companies are at risk of being digitally disenfranchised if you place a mandate on them, because they don't have the capacity to rapidly mobilize the kind of resources they need to to stay in business, to partake in those public sector projects, for example. So you don't want to edge them out, and the big companies that can afford to adopt technology or adopt BIM end up getting most of the jobs and forming some smaller companies under themselves and getting all the jobs. That would not be nice. So we know that the industry is already a fragmented you know place anyway. And if you allow this digital divide to come into play between the SMEs and the large organizations, then there'll be a problem, because you end up widening that gap that already exists even without digital technology. That's always been that gap between what the big companies can do and what the SMEs are capable of doing in terms of capacity, in terms of profitability, and the rest of it. You don't want to bring in this mandate that further pull them apart. You want to be able to bring them together close as much as possible. Um, there's that digital chasm that's emerging between SMEs and large organizations has not been understood very well, or properly studied, but we're getting there. There's a lot of research going on to try and understand this. Okay. But one thing that is important to realize also is that there's a theory called loss aversion theory. And what this theory means is that people are more sensitive to a decrease in their wealth than they are sensitive to increase in their wealth. You know, which results in the same consequences of losses being, the way your losses twice as much as you value your gain. What this means is that if I told you to listen to my presentation, as boring as it is, for the next 1 hour, and I will give you $10, or I said to you, if you don't watch my presentation for the next 1 hour, I'm going to fine you $10. People tend to respond more to the fine. People tend to be more sensitive to when they are going to lose money than when they are going to gain money. So what does this mean then? It means that some SMEs, when you mandate BIM, they will simply comply because they want to stay in business. They want to get jobs as subcontractors or whatever from the big companies or whatever, because they are loss averse. They don't want to lose jobs. So this means that even if they adopt BIM, they are not really doing it for the intrinsic benefits of being in terms of reducing waste, enhancing collaboration, making the world more sustainable in terms of construction, all that. That's not what they're really going to be doing it for. They're going to be doing it because you know what, they just have to survive in the harsh landscape. That's it, and that is not going to be a good outcome. Okay, so when you mandate BIM, some SMEs will just simply comply with the process of technology, but they don't really care about the long-term change to attitude, to behavior, to the benefits of in terms of environment and sustainability. And you know, it would be a sad case if that was to be the situation, you know. So in terms of nudge, then it has some risks as well. One shortfall is that when you restructure choices that leads to unintended consequences, people might react adversely to having their decision being manipulated. And manipulated is in quotes. But you see, the point is not that you are manipulating people; you are just trying to make people behave better when you nudge. But if people misunderstand it, they might think you manipulated them. So you have to do it in a very clever way. Okay. And they say this is regardless of whether or not that nudge thing is beneficial or not. Some people's mindset is just that they don't like being manipulated, in quote. And I think to understand this manipulation thing, I should give an example of how nudge theory has been used in practice. I think it's an airport in Amsterdam, Schiphol, if I'm not mistaken, where it was observed that in the male toilets, um, it was always messed up when the men went there to urinate. You know, there was a lot of urine everywhere, and someone came up with a clever theory. And what he did was that he asked the facility managers of the airport to etch, to draw, to paint a fly. You know, a fly, the insect, to paint a fly in the urinals, in somewhere in the middle of the urinals, and that worked because I say most men will tell you when you go to do your business and you see a fly, your natural urge is to flush it away. In the process of trying to flush it away, you're actually urinating properly. So this is the point. Even if you're drunk, I think your aim would probably be much better if you had a fly to aim for. So that is an example of how nudge can make people do good things without them being realized this is what is being done to them. Okay, you can imagine a drunk person or a frequent traveler saying, "Oh, I'm not happy that I was made to urinate properly because I was tricked into urinating on a fake fly." I don't think you're going to have that kind of problem. So therefore, it is said that nudge tends to work best when users are not aware that their behavior is being influenced by choice architects or by policymakers. So you have to be careful to that they're not aware that this is what you're trying to do to them. Okay, they might be aware, but you do your best to make sure they're not really aware. So those guys who developed nudge theory are two professors, Thaler and Sunstein. They advocated for transparency in the nudge process because they talked about the publicity principle because they were worried that if it's not transparent, if people are not aware of some of the issues that are being tackled by that nudge thing, they might react in a way that is not desirable. Okay, so this publicity principle emphasizes the benevolent standpoint, which forbids governments from implementing a policy that they will not be able to defend or that is not good for the majority of the people. So if the government successfully nudges an industry towards BIM and stakeholders find out that they've been nudged to do BIM, they should legally and ethically, as the government, should be legally and ethically be able to defend the reason why it made BIM mandatory. You should go to court of law and say this is why we did it. It's good for the environment, it's good for productivity, it's good for waste management and all those wonderful things that BIM is supposed to deliver. So, will a hybrid solution be one way to go about it rather than mandate it or to nudge it? Possibly. If you combine mandate and nudge, you have a sort of compromise of some sort. Um, yeah, that could be one way to go about it, you know. But it's helpful to work with stakeholders to try to get the right balance, you know. Because when you mandate or nudge, there will be a push-pull strategy involved. The push is the mandate where you're pushing people to do certain things, okay, and making the industry, for example, appreciate the importance of BIM. You can push it down their throats. But the pull is to get them to want to adopt, BIM technology. For those of them that may struggle, for example, with the adoption process, you can pull them up by giving them subsidies and helping them out when they're stuck with certain cost or issues that is making life difficult for them, especially the SMEs. Okay, so this I think will be a good way for a country wanting to implement BIM, adopt BIM in its construction industry to adopt a kind of hybrid solution. Don't think you can just mandate and force people to do things because they might be doing it but for the wrong reasons and it should not be nice at the end of the day. Now, is it only BIM that can be mandated? I try to use BIM as an example because it's a very popular process anyway that most people have heard of. But there are other things that I think that governments around the world, especially in developing countries, can start to think about mandating. in the near future. Even in developed countries, they might want to do things like this. For example, why not mandate e-tendering? The tendering process, why cannot be electronic and mandated? It's not just because of the lockdown of COVID-19 and remote working and online working. No, e-tendering has been around for almost 2 decades or more. Um, in some places, it is gradually being implemented as part of BIM processes, but it has stood alone as an independent approach or process. And I think I'd like to see the process of tendering for jobs being electronic. There's been a lot of transparency in the process, but also you could get rid of some of the issues that have to do with people trying to bid for a job from different parts of the world or parts of the country, and logistic issues will be resolved. And access to design digital models and digital tools will make the whole thing integrated with the BIM process. So I think it's high time we made e-tendering mandatory. Smart buildings can be mandated. Not every single building out there, not every school should be made smart, but as many buildings as possible, we should start to mandate them, especially new ones, and maybe even the existing ones. We could try to refurbish them because we need to start laying the foundation for the future smart cities of tomorrow. Okay. GIS BIM integration. Why not? This is a logical integration, but not everyone's aware of this. But they all are data-driven processes and or systems, GIS and BIM, and I think that there's a lot that can happen when you integrate them together for again smart cities and better outcomes for everyone. Artificial intelligence can be mandated in some ways. For example, when it comes to aspects of sustainability or health and safety, energy efficiency, I think there are ways that governments can make the use of AI in certain aspects mandatory. Because if we know that fossil fuels, and we know already fossil fuels cause a lot of damage to the environment, and the way we operate our buildings in terms of energy supply and demand, it's not quite efficient, then we can enforce the use of certain smart technologies, for example, or artificial intelligence that can help us make decisions on a global basis, on a national basis, in such a way that we are able to make decisions much better than we would normally have done without the use of artificial intelligence, without the use of computers and machine learning and stuff like that. And finally, I'd like to see some aspect of blockchain or smart contracts being mandated, for example, to tackle aspects of corruption, maybe through some sort of e-payment, blockchain-based payments, so you can literally track how money flows in the system. Um, Assets can be implemented into blockchain, ownership of them. Payment of contractors and subcontractors is one of the issues that bedevils the construction industry, where the big companies do not want to pay their subcontractors on time or whatever, for whatever reason. And if you use smart contracts, people get paid when they need to be paid, and they will not be struggling to get their payment. So the fourth part of my presentation is about the barriers to technology adoption. Basically, what I want to talk about here are some of the challenges that we need to overcome in terms of digital transformation. Lack of client demand, when there's no pull factor, can be a big problem, you know. But then again, if you think about it, patients who are clients of doctors are not the ones telling their doctors about the latest treatments. So doctors themselves have a responsibility to tell the patients, oh, this is the latest drug, this is the latest scanning for cancer or whatever, chemotherapy. You need to think about whether you want to go for this, blah, 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 blah. So I think it's important for us as professionals not to wait for clients to ask for BIM or digital processes or digital transformation. We can lead the way and get this done. So although lack of client demand is indeed a factor, we can overcome this by being proactive. Affordability and cost of implementation is it's going to be a big issue because large firms can easily afford to digitize their processes, but the SMEs might struggle. In fact, they will struggle. Most of them do struggle without government support. Lack of capacity and skills, whether it's at an individual level or in-house in a firm or an organization, you don't have that capacity to digitally deliver. You need to have skilled people to implement digital transformation. Okay, but everyone has to buy into it. It can't just be, oh, that's the tech guy, that's the BIM guy over there, that's the technology guy, that's the smart digitization guy. No, everybody has to be on the same journey. Poor access to enabling technologies, software, hardware, internet connectivity for object libraries and commodity environments. You can't take this for granted. People need to be able to have the right tools and the right components and system to use in order to become digitally compliant. Need standards and policies, so the absence of them will become a problem. There are some global standards like ISO 19650 for BIM and the rest of it, but there are other aspects that are not BIM related in construction, like lean construction, like health and safety, that also require policies that can make them work for a country or a region. I mean, global standards are helpful, but most times people have to take them and contextualize them in order to make them fit for purpose. Okay, but sometimes the standards or policies that you require can even be at a company level. It doesn't have to be a global ISO standard or a national standard. It could just be a company standard, a way of doing things that you can roll out across all the branches of that company. There are legal, data, and privacy issues, also with security issues that have to do with going digital, whether it has to do with ransomware or espionage or people just hacking into your systems just for the sake of it, to hijack your data or just to play pranks. There are a lot of issues that have to be covered, and so this could be an issue for some companies to deal with. Um, the lack of knowledge about the intrinsic benefits of digital transformation. People just need to know why it's beneficial to go digital. If they don't know that, they don't understand that benefit, then it's not going to work well for them. It could be people going to do that loss aversion thing I talked about. They'll just do it because you told them to do it, but you want people to do it because they want to do it, not because they have to do it. Because that will make them more involved, more engaged in the whole thing. And finally, there's also cultural resistance and organizational barriers to change. Some people are just stubborn, or rather, they're just too busy to want to improve. This is how we've always done things. If you hear anyone say this is how we've always done things, run away. Just know that that person you're speaking to is not innovative. That person is locked in a cultural mindset. Because what do you mean this is how we've always done things? It's a very unprogressive way of looking at things. Okay, right. So finally, I want to go through the sort of things that we can mandate or not. What do we mandate? Who will do this mandating, and when should it happen? Let's start with what we should mandate. I think that, for example, government projects that have specific value or specific level of complexity, like like airports or hospitals, or some projects that have national importance. These are the sort of things that you want to mandate with to start with. You know, you don't want to start mandating every single two-bedroom house out there. It's not going to be easy because those kind of projects done by SMEs anyway, and they will struggle to if you want to start with this kind of mandates. So large projects is what I'm talking about. Some of them could just be high-profile regional projects. For example, in Lagos, Nigeria, we have what they call the Eco-Atlantic City, where they're reclaiming parts of the Atlantic Ocean and building an artificial island, more or less extending the landmass of Lagos State and creating a new city of some sort there. So if they had mandated BIM or digital processes on whatever on that project, this could have been a very good way of showcasing it as a demonstrator project, a pilot project of some sort in future. But I don't know if the government is doing that. If they are not, then it's a lost opportunity. But it's never too late. I mean, because the island, the Eco-Atlantic City is still in its infancy anyway. Those projects are funded by donor agencies, international organizations like DFID, EU, USAID. That's sort of things that you might also want to place a mandate on. So in this case, the client, the donor agencies can say, we are going to pay for this school or this hospital in this community, but we want you, the designers and contractors, to adopt such and such and such technology. Okay, we're not talking about your typical borehole project or your well that the donor agency will or Oxfam will build somewhere. No, we're talking about big projects, schools, hospitals, and the likes. Okay. Um, there's some private sector projects also that could be mandated, in some sort. If you have a private sector led development like a high rise residential apartment or hotel or office, you could say as a government that because of fire safety or structural integrity reasons or even sustainability reasons, we need you to comply with these aspects of BIM. It doesn't have to be all aspects of BIM, but it'd be nice if they could do that. But at least you can tell them to comply with certain aspects that could make life better and safer for the end users at the end of the day. Um, organizational standards and policies can also be mandated by private developers without waiting for a government or of some sort to tell them they need to do certain things. If you're a large organization, either a client like maybe a national hospital network or a school chain, or you're even a construction organization, you can come up with your own BIM standards or your own digital transformation standards. You don't have to wait for someone else to tell you this is what you should do. Also, the teaching and learning of digital construction and BIM can be mandated. Why not? But you need the regulatory and accreditation bodies in charge of these sort of things, accreditation to make this mandatory. Say, we're not going to give you accreditation as a whatever as a degree course unless you implement certain things here and there to show that your graduates are going to come up with skills that are relevant to the digital world that we live in. All right. Now, The second part is who should be involved in developing a national mandate. It all depends from one country to the next, of course. It depends on the scale and scope of mandate that we're talking about. But basically, I think all key stakeholders need to be involved. But in no particular order, I'm talking about your clients, the government or the agencies, like the government control agencies, policymakers at the local, state, or federal levels, professionals of all callings in the construction industry, craftsmen and unskilled laborers, because at the end of the day, somebody has to build what we design. It's no use doing BIM and having 4D models, clash detection. Some unskilled laborer is probably going to be involved in putting that up, So if he's not interested or invested in what you're trying to do, then you're just going to end up wasting your time. Like they say, you can clash detect all you want in a design, but all it takes is for a plumber or a bricklayer to move a system or equipment by 10 cm or 1 foot, and all your clash detection will just collapse overnight. So you need to get them involved to understand what's happening. Professional and regulatory bodies also need to be involved. Technology providers, those who make the software, the hardware, the broadband services, the internet, and the rest of that, they all have to be brought on board as well in this journey. Educational institutions, whether talking about colleges, universities, or private trainers, they are also important stakeholders. International donor agencies need to be involved as well, because in many countries, in Africa in particular, a lot of large projects come about because of funding from donor agencies or even credit agencies. Even the World Bank has the right to say, we're going to fund this project, this airport, but we want you to use BIM, for example. And that could be something that could be helpful for getting the industry to be ready for digital transformation. But of course, when the World Bank says such things, they have to understand the capability and skill level of that country before you impose something that is impossible. Of course, the general public, the end users, are going to use all these buildings and infrastructure that we build. So they have to be involved as well in developing a mandate and to appreciate and understand what it's all about and how it should be implemented and the rest of it. And then we have private sector clients and developers as well, who are funding their own projects, and they own their own projects. So why not get them involved as well? Because it doesn't have to be just public sector things that are private sector can also benefit from mandates. Finally, when should a mandate kick in? This is a very tricky question. These are just some thoughts of mine. Some of you might agree with them, some of you might disagree. But I think that first of all, adequate planning is required, because you need to have policies, processes, awareness, training, upskilling, and the rest of that. Okay, before you start to think about mandate, you don't just wake up and announce a mandate. It's not done like that. No country has done it that way, and so it should not be something anybody should contemplate. So if you think about Africa, well, because this is being Harambe, so we're contextualizing this to Africa, I think perhaps a 10-year implementation plan will be enough. This is just a suggestion, or you need to do the stakeholder engagement and you need to do the research to find out if maybe 7 years is actually better, or it could be done in 5 years. But I think a 10-year implementation plan will be helpful. And let me explain why I think it's necessary. Because I think a two-pronged approach will be helpful for construction industry in Africa. First of all, you need to have, like, let's say, the educational side of things, the education and research, where you mandate being in the educational sector first, and year 1 to year 5, and you are also doing some pilot projects along the way that demonstrate the value of BIM. And then the professional BIM mandate from year 6 to 10 can be applied to selected projects and types, nationally or regionally or whatever. This is necessary for one or two things. You see, when you use the education-based approach, you're going to minimize the cost of BIM implementation. We know that SMEs, who form the bulk of the industry, struggle especially with the cost of implementation. But because BIM technology and BIM processes can be implemented in the curriculum much cheaper, in fact, in many cases free, than you would do it in the real professional world where they have to pay for everything, then why not train your future professionals to use BIM from school? That way, you gradually reduce the cultural resistance to change, because as the graduates are coming out of school with new skills, they're replacing the older generations. So that resistance to change is going to be will just wilt and die away in some years to come. For example, in as little as 5 years, if this year you produce a whole set of BIM graduates that are BIM compatible, next year you do the same thing. In 5 years, imagine the army of skilled graduates who are BIM compatible that you will have produced. Just within 5 years alone. So you can see that you could make some substantial difference if you were to start by training those who are still in school today, so that gradually you are creating a new workforce of some sort. And then also research into BIM and digital construction will feed into the industry practice and vice versa. So you don't want to just mandate BIM in the industry where the research side of things is left behind, because there'll be differences in culture, in climate, in national needs, in economy, in GDP, and all those sort of things. And we need research to be able to make sure we're doing the right things, prioritizing the right kind of projects, and coming up with the right kind of policies for each country. All this requires research. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and you do have a good day.